It's kind of like the thing we do when we have any set of witnesses. Someone's going to tell me a story about the crime, and I've got to figure out, why should I trust this guy? Why should I trust her? I had a murder that occurred in 1981 in our city in this house. And this murder was of a high school girl, a junior, who was stabbed to death. And it was a tragic event. And many years went by before we reopened the case. And by the time we reopened the case, we started to talk to the people who knew her or knew something about the murder or lived next door to her or worked with her, people in her sphere of influence. And we asked them questions about what happened that day and what they knew about it. And while all their stories had common features, they all knew that she had been murdered in her house after walking up the street with somebody she didn't know who she let in the house. Those are all common features, which is why, young ladies, you never let anybody in your house. Right? This is what parents always worry about. This is like a parent's worst nightmare. But when you talk to people about how she was killed, her friends would sometimes contextualize their memory of what occurred or what they really thought had occurred, and they only got some of the features correct. So for example, you might ask, well, how was she killed? One person told me that she was convinced she was killed by somebody from school, her high school where she attended. Another person told me, no, actually it was a coworker at the pizza joint down the street where she used to work named Jason. Another person told me, no, actually it was this crazy neighbor like 3 doors down who lived next to us for years, and I knew that boy was crazy, and he's who killed her. What they were doing was kind of contextualizing the event in their own memory. Yeah, she did work with somebody named Jason, and the other coworker they shared always suspected Jason was the killer. And so now 25 years later, tell me about it. Oh, we had a coworker named Jason. That's the guy who did it. It wasn't really the guy who did it, but you see what she's doing? She's taking her own experiences and she's adding a feature. We know one thing for sure. Somebody did follow her up that street, walk with her, get in her house, spend some time with her, and then kill her. That we know. And while these other details change because each person's contextualizing, one person thought she was strangled for sure. That's what she heard from her friends. Another person thought she was murdered with a hatchet. Pretty wide range of ways of dying, huh? All the common features were there, but the variations were different based on the contextualization of each person. I think something similar is probably happening with the flood story. We see a large overlap in terms of what the basic features are of the event, the same way I did here, but each person telling it borrows some character from their own context and inserts that character. It's not Noah, it's somebody else. It's Gilgamesh, or it's Uruk, or it's some other Akkadian character from a prior mythology, whoever it may be. They insert and contextualize what they want to bring to the account. Does that make sense? What I have to figure out is, when talking to these people, how much of this is their own insertion, and what's the core truth I can mine out that I can trust. And that's what we're doing with this account from Noah. We're trying to find what is the core truth. Because we'd like to think that the only truth that's out there is the version of Moses. But as I said, there are other versions. We've got 3 ancient versions of a flood account. 3. One is found right here in Genesis, the flood of Noah. But it isn't the only ancient account of a flood. There are 2 more. One is found in this tablet, which is the ancient account of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is found in tablet 11. Now, Gilgamesh there are several versions of this story that have been found in different archaeological sites. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's another ancient version of the story that is the flood of Atrahasis, found in an epic that precedes Gilgamesh. In fact, people think that Gilgamesh's text borrows from Atrahasis. So the question, of course, is which of these should I trust? Let me put them in a timeline. If I was to draw a timeline, and at one end of the timeline I put today, and at the beginning of the timeline I put way back when, okay? Now, if I look at where these stories appear, you're going to discover that the European stories are not as ancient as the ones around the Mediterranean. And the stories in the Americas are actually not as ancient as the stories in Europe. In other words, it looks like the stories are following people as they migrate across the globe. So my question is going to be, well, where do these stories come from? That's probably the story I can trust, right? Well, there is an ancient version that Moses writes in 1400 BC. There it is. The problem, of course, is that there are other ancient versions. Now, Gilgamesh, actually, the copy we have that actually includes the best flood narrative, comes from about 1000 to 1300. But the problem is that most scholars see that the insertion about the flood actually comes from the epic of Atrahasis, which occurs prior. That's a much older copy. 1625 is a lot older than 1400. So why should I believe that Moses' copy in 1400 is the source? It's clearly not the earliest. How do I know that Moses isn't just repeating some mythology that he heard before him? Well, it turns out that no one on the wall is describing an event that they actually saw. And by the way, either is the author of the Akkadian version. They're not describing something they saw firsthand. They're all describing an event that occurred prior to them. Does that make sense? So really the question isn't about whether, in order to figure out this out, I got to figure out which of these early versions should I trust. That's really what this comes down to. I know I had a murder in 1981. I know it had certain characteristics. The question is, which witness afterwards should I trust? Right? Same thing. I know I've got an early event. I've got 3 people describing it. Which one should I trust? Make sense?